So hi everyone, I'm Olivia Clifton and I'm really excited to welcome Professor Amos Tai to give our seminar today. Amos research spans many different groups at GISS, like tropospheric composition and climate impacts, especially having to do with agriculture. And so Amos has been a professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, or CUHK, since 2013. He obtained his PhD from Harvard and was a Croucher postdoctoral fellow at MIT. And his research combines high-performance Earth system modeling and statistical analyses of observations to examine the complex interactions between ecosystems and the atmosphere, addressing pressing issues such as the impacts of air pollution and climate change on ecosystems and food security, and how agriculture and forests can be better managed to mitigate environmental impacts. And so, Amos, we thank you so much for being here today at 1 a.m. your time. And with that, I'll have you take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Olivia, for the very kind introduction, and also thank you, Maggie, for organizing this seminar, and also thank you, Susanna, for inviting me to have this seminar. So I'm very excited to be here sharing with you about my research. So today my topic, I call it How Do Land Use, Agricultural, and Dietary Changes Affect Human Health and Ecosystems Through Modifying the Atmosphere. So as an atmospheric chemist by training, so most of my focus would be on how all of these processes coming from agriculture, forest management may affect atmospheric chemistry and with implications for air quality and climate. I'm sure a lot of people at NASA GISS work on very related topics. Let's see. Oh, okay. You're right. So just a brief overview of my research directions. I call my research group the TIE group for atmosphere biosphere interactions. So we really try to focus on the interactions between the atmosphere that would include components like air pollution, climate change, and the natural vegetation as well as crops. We don't only look at the one-way interaction. We try to look at two-way interactions between these entities. So our research focuses on three major directions. First would be the impacts of air pollution and climate change on agricultural and forest productivity. So we all know ozone is a very damaging gas for plants and crops. So we look a lot at how ozone damage may have implications for food security. We also are looking at how heat wave, for instance, together with ozone can affect global food security and ecosystem productivity. But today, unfortunately, I don't think I have enough time to talk about these aspects. So I will focus on two other major aspects of my research instead. Another important direction is the effects of vegetation, land use, and forest management on air quality and climate. So I think many of you here understand how atmospheric chemistry can be shaped by the biosphere. For instance, plants can emit a lot of biogenic volatile organic compounds. It also controls dry deposition of different atmospheric components. So through these processes, they can really have a dominant control on atmospheric chemistry and air quality. And other processes like reforestation, wildfires would affect all of these land-atmosphere exchange. So our research looked quite a lot at these things. So today, maybe at the latter part of this my presentation, I will talk a little bit about this. But today, a majority of my research will be on this third direction, namely how sustainable food production and consumption may actually be used to help mitigate air pollution and climate change, something that I started a couple of years ago, and I feel like this is a very important research direction that are very related to many of the sustainable development goals and also very much related to the development of many developing countries, which are always striving for sort of co-benefits between food security, climate change mitigation, and protection of public health. So I will start, on this. And I have to say sorry again, because I definitely overestimated my energy level at 1 a.m. in the morning. So yeah, I'm not as young as I like myself to be. Right, but in terms of tools, I'm not going to dive too deep into the methodology. So basically, most of the results that I'm showing to you today would be, so the methodology behind would be Earth system modeling. So we used different sorts of models, including climate model, coupled with atmospheric chemistry component. We also use geoschem, which is like a standalone chemical transport model. I think many of you may be very familiar with this already. And we also use a land surface model like CLM. Tamir is a ecosystem model that we developed among ourselves. And we basically use different models depending on the question at hand. And we developed them, we applied them, we also combined them with novel multivariate statistical analysis of global observations in order to look at the issues that I've just mentioned. All right, so let's dive into the first topic that I would like to focus on today, the impacts of agriculture on air quality and climate, and how we may actually improve air quality by basically focusing on agriculture. I think many of you here probably are familiar with this. Agriculture is responsible for many of the environmental threats that human beings are facing today. It is responsible for nearly 30 to 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions because CO2 is emitted when we turn forest into cropland, when we have to burn the forest to create croplands, fertilizer use, and the animal waste from meat production also emit a lot of N2O, which is a very strong greenhouse gas. There we've got methane, the cattle, the rice paddies all give methane. So together, all of these would be important sources of greenhouse gases contributing to climate change. And many other environmental impacts of agriculture, which I'm not going to talk too much about. I would just like to focus on these last point. Fertilizer use and pesticide use can lead to air and water pollution. In addition, of course, agriculture, modern farming can lead to soil degradation, increased pests and diseases, so on and so forth. So many studies, as you can see from high impact journals, focus a lot on how the food systems and agriculture contribute to climate change through greenhouse gas emissions. So as I've just mentioned, up to about 30 to 40% of the up to about 30% of the global greenhouse gas emission is actually related or emitted from the global food systems. Okay, and you can see here the absolute amount is actually rising over time by quite a lot, and most of the rise actually happens in developing countries. All right, so the total greenhouse gas emission from the global food system has been really rising and almost doubling over the past few decades. So we would definitely like to see, how we can improve the food system in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But many studies have already focused on this. Indeed, fewer studies, I would say, focus on another aspect of the food system, namely the nitrogen pollution coming from agriculture. So this is just a sort of like a representation of the kinds of environmental threats that human beings are facing, being framed as planetary boundaries, which are kind of like the safe operating space for humanity. So when you look at this picture, all right, so if a particular wedge is beyond the circle, then that problem is actually very serious. That particular aspect or that particular environmental threat is definitely being operated sort of beyond the Earth's capacity to handle it, all right? So, and if it is within the green space, okay, then it's kind of still like, oh, the Earth is still kind of able to handle this, to recycle, to cope with this situation or this environmental threats. And if the wedge is somewhere in between the green zone and the outer edge of the circle, then they're kind of like, we are kind of reaching the limit. We are not too certain about the effect, but then it is becoming very serious. So you can see climate change is definitely already out of the green zone. So it is a serious problem. There's still a lot of uncertainty. It may not be at the point of no return yet. But you can see biodiversity loss is really way out there. It's a very serious problem now. And you can also see nitrogen emission is also way out there. The Earth ability to handle our nitrogen pollution we have already exceeded that limit for Earth to handle our nitrogen emission. So I would argue, nitrogen emission should be even receive more attention to tackle. So here I'm showing you how human activities are disrupting the nitrogen cycle. So these are the fluxes of different kinds of reactive nitrogen, okay, from the surface to the atmosphere. The black numbers are the total, whereas the red numbers in the brackets are the anthropogenic contribution. So you can see NOx emission, right? Nitrogen oxides, okay, most of it, actually nearly all of it is anthropogenic by nature. It is emitted from fossil fuel combustion, of course, it's anthropogenic, but there are also NOx from biomass burning, some of which can be natural, but much of it is actually related to human activities. So, and NOx, of course, play a very significant role in atmospheric chemistry, leading to the formation of ozone when it is reacting with different sorts of chemical components like VOC, CO, methane under sunlight. And agriculture also turns out to be a very important source of reactive nitrogen. You can see ammonia, which is a very alkaline gas. Most of the ammonia emitted from the land surface to the atmosphere is related to agriculture, okay? Because we are using a lot of fertilizer. The fertilizer contains nitrogen, which would be volatilized to become ammonia in the atmosphere. There are also N2O, as I've already mentioned. N2O is a very important greenhouse gas contributing to climate change. And another important aspect here is that the NOx, right, can be oxidized in the atmosphere to form nitric acid, okay, which is an acid, of course. And nitric acid can react with ammonia, okay, in the atmosphere and basically forming ammonium nitrate, which is a very important component for aerosol. So you can see nitrogen, reactive nitrogen from fossil fuel combustion and agriculture is not only a potent greenhouse gas contributing to climate change, but it would also contribute to air pollution by basically forming more ozone under sunlight together with VOC, CO, methane, so on and so forth, but also help form more particulate matter or PM2.5 through this through such reactions there. So yeah, and so here in the next few slides, a lot of our studies actually focus on how reactive nitrogen emission from agriculture and fossil fuel combustion contribute to air pollution. All right, so that would constitute the majority of what I'm going to present today. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. PM2.5 is a very serious air pollutant with major health impact. This is a picture showing you how in Beijing on a very bad day with a lot of PM2.5, you can basically not see across the window, all right? But on a clear day after raining, you can see across the window, see across the street, see the next building there. But this is actually quite a typical, not an uncommon day in Beijing, all right? And the PM2.5 level can actually really hurt human health. So recent estimate actually, there is a recent estimate, by living in Beijing because of the PM2.5, your life expectancy can be reduced by about 3 years, right? So that is actually quite a serious health impact. So a lot of the focus, so this is obviously a very serious problem in China. A lot of the focus on reducing air pollution in China has focused mostly on fossil fuel combustion or fossil fuel regulation by perhaps cutting power plant emission, by cutting vehicle emissions, right? So that makes sense because the majority of PM2.5 is still related to fossil fuel combustion. But as I've mentioned, a lot of most NOx is from fossil fuel combustion, but a major component, ammonium nitrate, the ammonium there is indeed from agriculture. So we have been thinking, perhaps we can also try to target agriculture in order to reduce pollution. So this is where a few of our studies are trying to focus on. So this is just another illustration of how PM2.5 have different components. Most importantly, the ammonia from agriculture contributing to ammonium, and the NOx usually from fossil fuel combustion, so on and so forth, right? So I'm not gonna focus too much on this. So this is one of our study. We want to see how perhaps if up to about 30% of PM2.5 in China is related to agriculture, perhaps we can do something to agriculture. We can improve the way food is grown in China in order to help solve the issue of air pollution. Even though, of course, we know fossil fuel combustion is still the major source, and a lot of effort has already been done conducted to try to reduce fossil fuel emission. Perhaps we can also do something related to agriculture, especially in the future. Many studies have already shown how China has been reducing or tackling its fossil fuel combustion emissions. And in the future, the agricultural contribution is indeed gonna become more and more important. And we should start thinking about how to address this before too late. So here, one approach we have thought of is perhaps we can target at reducing. We can try to reduce the amount of fertilizer used in the field in order to reduce the nitrogen emission. One way to do it is intercropping with soybean, a very interesting idea that actually came from my colleague who have many collaborations in mainland China. They are all agricultural and biological scientists. What they have seen in the field is that intercropping as a more sustainable way to grow food is very efficient in its water and nitrogen and fertilizer use, is very efficient in land use, it also helps increase the crop yield as well. So from a biological perspective or from an agricultural perspective, it is really great for the farmers. But what they think is happening is, well, it should have intercropping. If it is so good for the crops, for the farmers, perhaps it would also have some environmental benefits. So there we came in as atmospheric scientists. We then try to see if intercropping as a more sustainable farming method may actually have a larger impact on the atmosphere, having benefits beyond the farm scale. So what is intercropping after all? It is basically growing two different kinds of crops together at the same time, all right? So that sounds trivial, but indeed, most of the agricultural fields in the world right now, or at least in the major agricultural regions right now, are monoculture, basically growing the same type of crop over like a large area. Intercropping is different. We are trying to grow, intercropping is where people grow two different kinds of crops together. Here we're particularly looking at intercropping with soybean. Soybean is a very interesting crop. It is a nitrogen fixer because it is a legume plant. So its root would have nodules that host symbiotic bacteria that can perform nitrogen fixation. What that means is that if you grow soybean together with another crop, then the soybean itself would be fixing its own nitrogen, and the extra nitrogen can indeed be made available for the other crops as well, which basically means you can use less fertilizer. You can use less fertilizer, and the other crops like maize or wheat can still grow kind of happily. So we look at how intercropping may help reduce the amount of fertilizer used, okay? Because the soybean provide the other crops with enough or with some nitrogen already. So we use a model called DNDC, biogeochemical model, because it has a lot of agricultural practices there, so we don't have to invent things anew. And we implement intercropping in this model and try to see how much ammonia emission can be reduced, okay? And then we input that into the GISS chemical transport model and simulate the associated PM 2.5 concentration and the healthcare costs related to air pollution. What we have found is that if we implement intercropping across the entire China, okay, we can use less fertilizer and ammonia emission can indeed be reduced by up to about 60%. I'm sorry, about 50%, right? And then if you only look at maize soybean intercropping, okay, in this study we only look at maize soybean intercropping because our collaborators in China only look at maize soybean intercropping with significant data that we can actually use to put into the model. The result is that inorganic PM 2.5 would also be reduced by nearly 2 microgram per meter cube per year. This is the annual PM 2.5. And we further estimate that if not only maize soybean intercropping system are implemented, if we also sort of have wheat soybean intercropping and maybe rice soybean intercropping as well, up to about 10% of the PM 2.5 concentration can actually be reduced in China. So 2 to 10 microgram per meter cube may not look too much to you, but if you look at the associated healthcare cost or healthcare costs saved by the reduction of about 2 microgram per meter cube, it turns out to be actually quite a significant amount, up to about 13 billion US dollars per year of healthcare costs saved if you use soybean intercropping instead of monoculture. So yeah, so we basically show that, and then you also have an increased grain yield because you basically grow more soybean alongside the other crops, so you have an additional batch of crops for you to harvest as well. So there would be more revenue from grain yields, okay, for the farmers. They would have saved some fertilizer, okay, which amount up to about 0.5 billion. Intercropping is not always saving the cost. There would also be additional machinery and labor costs associated with intercropping because when you grow two different kinds of crops together on the same land, they are actually more, it is harder for the farmers to handle because the crops may actually have some differences in the planting date and harvesting day, and then they would actually need more machineries to specialize for intercropping. So there would be some additional labor and machine cost. But overall, we see that the improved healthcare cost, which the farmers themselves do not feel, but the whole population can feel, can actually be quite significant. So we show that intercropping with soybean can maintain yield while reducing reactive nitrogen emission, PM 2.5 pollution, and related premature deaths and healthcare costs. So alongside this line, we are also looking into, for instance, a student of mine is also looking at how shifting different kinds of animal production, all right, within China can help reduce ammonia emission. Because, for instance, if you concentrate the pig farms in some region instead of having it spread across the whole country, would that actually be more efficient or worse for ammonia emission? We are also looking into these kind of shifting animal production to see whether, and also different kinds of agricultural management, like using the 4R method to save fertilizer use. We are also looking at how these would have impacts on air quality and the related healthcare costs as well. So this is an ongoing area that we continue to look at. So we have kind of shown that sustainable farming methods in food production can have potential to both secure food production and reduce pollution-related healthcare costs in China. But then, well, that's only one side of the story, right? Agricultural production, I've just focused on the supply side. But after all, the food is produced for the consumers to eat, right? Or to consume. So perhaps we can also think about how the consumer, right, on the consumer side, on the demand side, can also help improve or reduce nitrogen emission and the larger environmental problems. As with the issue of greenhouse gas emission, different kinds of food have different carbon and nitrogen footprint, all right? So some foods have a lot more emission than others. And obviously you can see meat production generally has a lot more emission than say plant or crop, other kinds of plant crop production. So this is carbon, this is all carbon here, just as an example of how different foods would have different environmental impacts. And you can also see bovine meat, which means beef, is basically the largest emitter in terms of carbon, okay? So we then start to think, well, perhaps the way the Chinese populations have been eating over the past few decades might have been affecting air quality as well, right? Not only affecting greenhouse gas emission, but perhaps also nitrogen emission and thus air quality. So we have shown, we know that the Chinese population has been rising, a lot over the past 30 years or so. And at the same time, we also see that the average Chinese person has also been eating a lot more meat than about 30 years ago or 40 years ago. So comparing just these 30 years, okay, 2010 to 1980s, in just these 30 years, 3 decades, the average Chinese person has been eating 5 times more meat than 30 years ago. So quite a lot of studies have already seen how such a population rise and a change from a more plant-based diet to a more meat-intensive diet may be affecting climate change through greenhouse gas emission. And quite some studies have already looked at how that would lead to some direct health impacts, because when you eat more meat, then there would be overnutrition, obesity, diabetes, so on and so forth, right? But we wondered, well, perhaps more meat consumption can also lead to more ammonia emission and thus PM2.5 pollution, because a lot more fertilizer has to be used to grow the feed crops to feed the animals, right? And at the same time, the animals also have a lot of animal waste, okay? Their excretion, their feces and urine, they all contain a lot of nitrogen that can be volatilized to become ammonia. So all of these can contribute to air pollution. And we want to quantify how much of that is really related to the change in diet per se, and in turn leading to what we call the indirect health impact of dietary changes through worsening air quality. All right. So perhaps higher meat consumption, not only affect health directly for the people who eat more meat, but it may also have indirect health impact by worsening the air pollution. And that would not only affect people who eat more meat, but indeed the general population as well. So we try to combine different methodologies, different models, borrowing ammonia emission model from Zhang Lin from PKU, analyzing food data, using GISS-CAM, nested high-resolution GISS-CAM to simulate the PM2.5, and ultimately try to connect all of these to premature mortalities related to PM2.5. We use the model to perform different factorial experiment. We want to see how increased food production per se relative to fossil fuel combustion, okay, how much, what are their relative contribution to the worsening of PM2.5 in China within these 3 decades. We want to see how much of it is driven by population rise per se, all right, because higher population would lead to more food production, right? But how much of it is actually just driven by dietary changes, even if the population is not changing. And and we want to see, well, also, if we switch, from the current meat-intensive diet back to a more plant-based diet, how much of it would, how much pollution can be reduced. So this is the result. So here I'm showing you the PM 2.5 in 2010. And this here is the PM 2.5 changes that is coming only from agricultural production, okay? You can see agricultural production, the rising agricultural production over the past 30 years have increased PM 2.5 by up to 10 microgram per meter cube. Ammonia emission by about more than 60%, okay? Higher by more than 60%, and then PM 2.5 rising by up to 10%, 10 microgram per meter cube, which is actually significant. It is nearly 20% of the total PM 2.5 increase over the same period of time from all sources, which basically means that agricultural production, the rising agricultural production in China has been contributing to nearly 20% of the PM 2.5 problem, which is an often overlooked contribution, all right? Because as I've mentioned, most of the previous studies focused on fossil fuel combustion, but indeed, agricultural production is a major part of it, is a very significant part of it as well. We further see that, well, a higher agricultural production, is it just because we have more people and people eating more? Or is it because of the dietary changes? We found that it's indeed the dietary changes that are the dominant driver for this agriculturally derived PM 2.5. The diet-driven effects are much larger than the effects of population rise on food production per se. So basically, we have shown that indeed, higher meat consumption in China has been a quite important source of PM 2.5 problems in China. And we see that about, so this is the changes in premature mortality. We see that nearly 90,000 more people would die per year because of this agriculturally related or diet-related healthcare cost. And interestingly, we also notice some environmental justice dimension. Usually, it is the richer regions that eat more meat, but it's indeed the poorer regions, the poor agricultural provinces that suffer more air pollution. So we first noticed it when we published this paper in Nature Food about 2 years ago. And then we are now further trying to further look into the environmental justice dimension. So this is some recent preliminary result. What we have found is that there is a significant positive correlation between primary industry GDP, of course, which is mostly agriculture, and deaths associated with PM 2.5, right? So basically, where you have more agricultural regions, then there would be more agriculturally related PM 2.5. That's very trivial, okay? You have more agricultural production, so of course you would have more agriculture-related PM 2.5 deaths in those regions. But we want to see, we then, my student actually, Luo, he tried to divide the whole country into net food producing region and net food consumption region. So basically looking at how much food is produced and consumed in each of these provinces, okay? So there are provinces where food production and food consumption are more or less balanced. There are regions where you have more food production than food consumed, and the richest, I would say, the richest regions in China, all right? These Guangdong province, this is where Shanghai is, this is of course Beijing and Tianjin, and these are actually the food consumption region. They consume more food than they produce. And if you look at the PM 2.5 related mortality and GDP, obviously these region, the food consumption region, they are much richer than the food producing region, all right? But then for the PM 2.5 related mortality, the food producing region has a lot more PM 2.5 related deaths than food consumption region. So you can really see that lower income net food producing regions suffer more negative consequences of PM 2.5 than the higher income net food consuming regions, all right, which mostly drive the increasing agricultural, especially meat production. So yeah, so this is an environmental injustice aspect that we believe needs to be examined and considered further. I would just like to show you a few more results related. So this is the same study. We see that if we actually turn from a plant-based diet to a turn from a current Chinese diet to a more plant-based diet that are recommended by the Chinese dietary guideline, well, PM2.5, ammonia emission, PM2.5, and the related deaths can all be reduced. All right, so that is just basically one of the first few studies that show how dietary changes can indeed have health benefits that are beyond just eating less meat. It can also reduce air pollution and have health benefits. So we have shown thus far how sustainable farming methods for production and dietary choices for consumption can be important strategies to mitigate air pollution in China and also environmental impacts of agriculture. So this is the kind of like the beginning only. We are also interested in looking at, is the same kind of thing happening in other parts of the world? So we continue to use GISS to basically do the same research, okay? And then extending our period, looking at further back in history, right? Deriving our own ammonia emission inventory for the past few decades, and then using GISS to perform factorial experiments to look at how different factors affect PM2.5. Indeed, we are seeing very similar things happening, okay, in developing regions. So here, I'm showing you, here is the total changes in PM2.5 concentration due to all sources, including fossil fuel combustion, agriculture, so on and so forth. You can see here, there are major increases in developing regions, including China and India, but reduction mostly in North America and Europe, okay, because of tough regulation. So this is the sort of contribution from agriculture alone. This is the contribution from other anthropogenic emissions, including NOx and SO2. So you can see, if you compare these maps, if you just look at the globe as a whole, you can see, well, most of the changes in PM2.5 are still shaped by anthropogenic emissions of NOx and SO2, right? That makes sense. But in some regions, especially China and India, right, in East and South Asia, the rise in agricultural ammonia, okay, actually contributes to about 10 to up to 40, especially in China, of the total PM2.5 changes. Again, showing how significant the changes in agricultural production is towards the PM2.5. And again, we try to figure out where among the agriculturally derived PM2.5, how much of it is due to meat consumption, how much of it is due to just food crop consumption. And again, we found that 2/3 of the PM2.5 increases in East Asia, driven by agriculture, is actually related to meat consumption. Well, basically consistent with what we found in the Nature Food Study. But here we highlight that actually this is also happening in other parts of the world, but most significantly in East and South Asia. Right? And actually rising meat consumption plays the biggest role in China. And in India, the role is actually less. Well, that's obviously because of both religious and cultural reasons. The Indian population have not been eating that much more meat compared to 30 years ago than the Chinese population. We are also interested to see how, well, because the world is not only, these different agricultural regions are not only producing food for its own people, right? We are also importing and exporting food from and to other countries, right? So perhaps when we eat more food or eat more meat, okay, and if we import those food items from other countries, maybe we are also exporting the nitrogen emission to other countries, right? So many studies have shown this kind of import-export effect on fossil fuel related goods. So we're also interested to see whether food trade may actually help sort of import and export pollution to other places, right? So here we use the geoscam again to try to simulate, examine the largest food importing and exporting regions or countries, all right? And then we want to understand how food demand from specific country or region affects global air quality through domestic production minus export, okay, and import, all right? So we are kind of like for different major food consuming regions like China, okay? How much the Chinese, for instance, how much the Chinese food demand would affect global air quality, right? Through both, its own production and production elsewhere, which later are imported into China, or the other countries as well. We are looking at, many different kinds of countries, okay? So we do so by doing a simulation with the global emission, okay, ammonia emission, minus a particular country related to food production emission related to a particular country, plus the emissions related to food export to other countries, but minus other countries' emission related to food export to China. Just as an example, right? We are doing this for different kinds of countries as well. So basically, the result would be this. So in each of these maps, we are showing you how each of these regions, okay, how the food demand from each of these regions would contribute to global air quality. What we have found is that, well, indeed, domestic food demand greatly contributes to PM 2.5 pollution domestically and also to surrounding regions through atmospheric transport. For instance, like China, right? So this is the contribution to global PM 2.5 by the Chinese demand for food, okay? Both domestic production and import from other countries. So we can see it affects United States a little bit, but not too much. But mostly it affects itself and the surrounding regions just through atmospheric transport, okay? It's the same for other regions as well. Most of the pollution is just confined to its own production, right? Basically meaning that as a whole, import of food from other countries are not a major contributor to the pollution in other countries. The reason is mostly because when a particular region import food from other regions and countries, they are usually diluted. They don't only import all their food from only one other countries, right? They import from a variety of countries. So the impact of, so for that country, maybe import is important, but that import is distributed among many different regions in the world. So the pollution related to those import in other countries, from other countries, are actually diluted among a basket of countries. So that is sort of like major conclusions from this the result. So we are not really exporting the pollutions to other regions. I mean, most of the pollution is really locally confined. Right. Maggie, how much time do I still have left?
So we have about 15 minutes left. So just however much time you want to save for questions.
Oh, sure. So thank you so much. So these are some of our recent sort of studies on how food demand and food supply can be improved or tackled to help reduce nitrogen emission and ammonia and PM2.5 problems, right? So it doesn't only affect air quality through, hold on for a second. I want to show this. Yes, this one. So indeed, agriculture not only affect PM2.5, it can also affect ozone, right? Through some very interesting Earth system connections, okay? So in this another study that we have done, we also look at how future food demand, all right, production trend, according to FAO, may indeed enhance ammonia, nitrogen emission and deposition in the whole world, all right? So we know the whole world is, we are having more nitrogen in the future, and we are having more food production in the future. So definitely we will emit more nitrogen. And what comes up must come down finally. So that excess nitrogen would also be deposited back to the land and ocean surface. So perhaps that would affect ecosystems. And since ecosystems actually play very significant role shaping air quality, like ozone air quality, so perhaps there is some connection there. So in this study, we try to see how future food production would enhance future nitrogen deposition, which would then, so you can see here, so future nitrogen deposition would be enhanced because of the future increase in food production according to FAO. By future, I mean 2050, all right? This additional nitrogen emission can indeed enhance GPP, all right? Oh, by the way, these are all using, this is from CLN, all right? So you can see rising GPP, rising LAI, but usually in regions where, rising GPP, okay? And the impacts of enhanced nitrogen deposition is usually the strongest in places where you would have nitrogen limitation to begin with. It doesn't happen everywhere. Indeed, for some of the regions where you have a lot of increased nitrogen deposition, you don't really increase GPP that much because those regions is already saturated with nitrogen to begin with. All right, so you can imagine, well, China is actually quite saturated with nitrogen already. So enhanced nitrogen deposition doesn't really help its ecosystems, but in some other regions it can. And there can also be LAI changes and enhancement of NOx emission because the additional nitrogen deposition can sort of promote or stimulate microbial nitrification and denitrification, which would then, of course, help emit more NOx from the soil as well. So all of these together, soil NOx increasing, GPP or LAI increasing. LAI increasing would actually also reduce dry deposition, enhance dry deposition, but also isoprene emission. And thus, all of these together would indeed increase ozone by a few ppb. It's actually not very significant, okay? We would argue that, the current uncertainties in ozone simulation would be larger than 3 ppb anyway. So here, we just think, scientifically speaking, these kind of Earth system connections, the systematic enhancement in ozone because of enhancement in nitrogen deposition is still very interesting. It's not that big, but so this, we kind of showed how nitrogen, the problem of nitrogen through mediating the biosphere can ultimately affect ozone as well. Right, so I would definitely like to leave more time for questions. So in the final few minutes, I would just like to briefly mention another aspect of my research that is actually very related to what Olivia has been doing, and we have been collaborating on dry deposition, all right? So looking at how, another important part of my research is looking at how the biosphere control ozone air quality. So I think, I don't have to belabor on this. The biosphere control climate by affecting photosynthesis, evaporative cooling, and albedo. It also shape air quality through dry deposition and biogenic volatile organic compounds. So I'm just going to skip all of these. I would just like to mention this here. So part of our research really wants to look at how different processes can affect plants, right? So now, for instance, I've just shown you how nitrogen deposition may enhance photosynthesis, and through all of these connections would ultimately affect the boundary layer meteorology and ozone air quality as well, right? Because biogenic emission, dry deposition, transpiration, all of these are related to photosynthesis. Okay, so we're also interested to see how land use, forest management, rising CO2, ozone damage itself, and also plant responses to heat stress and water stress can modify all of these fluxes, ultimately affecting boundary layer meteorology and atmospheric chemistry. Okay, so we have done quite a bit of study on these processes, just like what I've shown you this one. I would just like to highlight a recent paper that we have that have been accepted by GMD, okay, where we implement a ecophysiology module in GeoScam. So GeoScam always has dry deposition, right? It's based on the very well-known Wesley scheme, which is a semi-empirical scheme with no explicit representation of the biological processes behind. So here we implemented in GeoScam photosynthesis simulation, stomatal simulation, basically the whole ecophysiology processes into GeoScam, so that within GeoScam we can simulate photosynthesis, impacts of ozone on GPP, and also how stomatal conductance can be shaped by or connected to photosynthesis and thus affecting dry deposition. We implemented how photosynthesis-based biogenic emission as well. And then we can then use GeoScam alone to look at biosphere-atmosphere interactions within the model. Of course, you can do the same kind of things using a fully coupled Earth system models, right? But there are definitely advantages of using GeoScam alone, right, to look at these things because, for instance, CSM can have very uncertain hydrometeorological simulations that can interfere with your ozone simulation. So here, if you only use GeoScam with prescribed meteorology, then at least you have reduced the uncertainty coming from the climate simulations, all right? And you can really focus on the biosphere-atmosphere interactions in terms of the chemistry. Yeah, so I'm just like to show you how we have improved. So this is the dry deposition velocity with the ecophysiology module.
Could you try?
And with the original Wesley scheme. And you can really see that the original Wesley scheme, dry deposition velocity, is actually not very good, all right? And I'm sure Olivia is very familiar with this. But by implementing ecophysiology into GeoScam, we greatly improved dry deposition velocity, all right? And then we also show in this paper that we can use this model to examine how rising CO2 can affect ozone level because higher CO2 can reduce stomatal conductance, higher CO2 can also reduce isoprene emission. All of these would affect ozone, all right? So we also see the effect on ozone through elevated CO2 concentration and their effect and its effect on plants. And yeah, so basically I would just like to sort of like advertise it a little bit here. So if this is a modeling framework that you think relevant for your work, or you would like to use this model for some of your work, or if you want to do some intermodal comparison, then you're very welcome to basically use this model as well. And the paper has been accepted, so it's going to be out. It's on EGU Sphere already, so you can already look at it. So I guess I would close because I would definitely like to take some questions. So yeah, so thus far, I've hoped that you have been convinced that tackling food production and consumption can actually do quite a lot of good things for not only our health, but also for mitigation of pollution and climate change. All right, so with that, thank you again, and I'd like to take any questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Amos. That was really interesting. I know we have a few questions online. So if you want to unmute yourself, or if not, I can read your questions for you. I think the first one we have is from Michael Wright. Would you like me to just read your question? Okay, I'll just read it out. So towards the beginning of the presentation, Michael asked, has your team assessed the impact of corn-based ethanol used in vehicular fuel to greenhouse gas emissions compared to using non-ethanol fuel?
Oh, I think this is a very important aspect that we haven't looked at yet. Yeah, so a lot of our studies thus far focus more on the short-lived species, right? So not too much on the long-lived greenhouse gas emission. Yeah, but I think doing the same, really assessing corn-based ethanol versus other fuel, and they're looking at their impact on short-lived species like ozone or PM 2.5 would. Yeah, I would really love to see that as well.
So we have a question in the room.
Yeah, I was have to run to another meeting, so maybe I can squeeze in real quick.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Cool. So, Amos, this was amazing. I really appreciated the wealth of your research and all these different topics, and many of them are really relevant for our own work. So, I'm Jonas Jägermeier. I coordinate the global gridded crop modeling in AgMet, and we're currently conducting a study where we try to pool different models, crop models, that can respond to ozone. So, we're doing a multimodal assessment with as many models possible. So I would like to talk to you and see if that's an effort that you're interested in contributing, running in a harmonized protocol to see how these different models respond under climate change throughout the end of the century under different climate change scenarios. So that's one thing. And then your work related to public health is also relevant to the Eat Lancet Commission work. I contribute to the version 2 of the Eat Lancet recommended diet, and that's the core goal, right? With a dietary change, what the environmental impacts, but also the human health impacts are. So we haven't looked so much on to. Did we just drop him?
I don't know.
Wow, yeah, I feel very excited about this. Yeah.
The screen just flipped, so but you can still hear me. Can you?
That was me.
Yes.
Yes, he can hear you. Mine exited out for no reason. Keep going.
So that's another thing. Now my question, I was really intrigued by your work on intercropping with soy and maize. But in many breadbasket regions, maize and soy is actually grown in rotation, not so much in an intercropping setup. So I wonder how much of these effects would be muted, or how much of these effects are we seeing already in a crop rotation? You plant soy one year and then corn or maize the other year, or even within the year in Brazil, you have them grown, right, but in sequence, not in parallel. Growing them in parallel is tricky, as you mentioned, in terms of labor and harvesting and all these different treatments. But I wonder, would your results still apply, or do you have a feeling to what extent these co-benefits that you're highlighting would be muted when we start from an already existing rotation rather than a plain monoculture?
Well, thank you very much for this. I'm not an agricultural scientist per se, but that piece of research definitely is in collaboration with agricultural scientists in mainland China. And from what I've learned from them is that intercropping is actually a lot more sort of like effective in its effects on, stimulating nitrogen, the competition in the soil, and thus basically promoting the sort of the availability of the nitrogen for the other crops more than crop rotation, because crop rotation is kind of like, well, the soybean can enhance the nitrogen in the soil, but then in the next season, by the time the next season is there, a lot of the nitrogen has already been lost, right? Through leaching, through other processes, volatilization. Yeah, so when you grow the two crops together, it's kind of like, making sure that the crops can directly benefit from what is being fixed right now. Yeah, so this is what I've learned from them. They all think, crop rotation is very kind of, a lot of places have been performing crop rotation already. Yeah, so intercropping is, I would say, is like even one step further in terms of its net benefit. Yeah, so, but then of course, if a field is sort of used to crop rotation, it will be easier to turn it into intercropping than, say, a monoculture field. Yeah, so that's my 2 cents. But I'm sure I would have to think more about this and maybe ask my agricultural scientist colleagues more about this to have a more definite answer.
Cool. I have to run to another meeting, but I will send you an email.
Oh, please, yeah. And for the crop intercomparison, is it what Lisa Emberson is also involved in?
Yeah, Lisa is part of it, and the AgMIP team, the GGCMI, the Global Gridded Crop Model Intercomparison. We have
yes. We are in touch with them. Yeah, we have been in touch with them, so I am aware of this. Yeah, I would definitely like to contribute.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
So we are a little past due, but I know we had a few more questions online. So Amos, I'll just leave that up to you if you want to.
Yeah, yeah, I don't mind at all if you don't mind spending a few more
2 a.m.
minutes.
At 2 a.m. Thank you. So we have a few questions from Susanna, who I think is still
Yeah.
online.
Yes, yes,
Can you hear me?
yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, you just get going, right? You just woke up. Yeah. First of all, you should come to GISS for a whole year. You should do a sabbatical, a double
I would love
sabbatical
to.
here.
Yeah, my
I think
sabbatical.
we have so much in common with the impacts group and the AgMap group and our interests. And so I could ask you 1,000 questions. The question I put in the chat was kind of just pointing out, the transportation sector that is linked to food,
Yep.
which is something. Do you think it's major? Do you guys plan to look at that? The
Oh,
impact
that's a
of,
very good
yeah.
question because I do have a slide on this, but I skipped it. So if you don't mind, I would just very quickly show this. If you don't mind,
Yep.
you can still see the slides now, right?
Yeah, we can see
Yes.
them.
Okay. So it's actually here in a slide that I actually skipped. So if you look at, well, first of all, this is for greenhouse gas emission, but then when you talk about greenhouse gas emission, usually, the nitrogen emission would be kind of quite linearly correlated with greenhouse gas emission anyway. So when you do comparison across different sectors, there would be some analogies there that would be relevant for nitrogen as well. You can see here, actually, most of the greenhouse gas emission is from the land transformation, the fertilizer use in agriculture, and also the animal waste. Methane would be from, the cattle, the guts of the cattle, all right? And indeed, transportation together, all right, and processing all of these together actually is less than 10% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So if you do similar kinds of study, you will also see that among all of the emissions, okay, it's usually the agricultural processes themselves that emit the greatest amount of pollutants, right? And the transport, of course, would be part of it, but it's usually the minority instead of the majority. So I would say, yes, it would be important, and I would definitely like to look at how international travel, if we also count the NOx emission from the transport as well, how that would contribute to the whole issue. But I already kind of expect it would be relatively minor compared to the other
Yeah,
processes
I'm
or
not so
sectors.
sure because, if you think about the air pollution question, the mortality, the agricultural emission needs NOx in order to make nitrate.
True. Yes.
And that is a big thing. So, I don't know if you know my paper I did on air pollution. So it was, looking at agricultural air pollution globally. And, when I did the paper, I expected in the future, this is becoming a much bigger problem because agricultural emissions is the only sector that's expected to go up.
Oh,
And
yes,
other
yes.
pollution sectors are supposed to go down, but I did find the opposite, that in the future, surface air pollution is going down because nitrate is moving to higher levels because the surface NOx pollution is decreasing. So I think, just to look at that together might be interesting just in terms of air
Absolutely. Yeah.
association.
So when I say minority, that can
Yeah.
still be like a big impact there, and it would be increasingly important, right? So because
Yeah, and especially for the US, where, the food production is kind of in the Midwest or far away from here. And so we don't get that direct impact if we only look at the agricultural emissions itself, because it's so far away from the big population centers. But I think that's not the full story. And yeah, I mean, I'm such a big fan of your work, as I say
thank you
every
so
time.
much. Yeah.
But
Likewise. Yes.
well, we haven't done too much in this because I really wanted, like, this slide is perfect for this because we do climate modeling. So we are not so perfect in details in air pollution. We look at the big picture, the big time scales. And there I felt, if we talk about agriculture, it's so much more interesting to look at it holistically, including greenhouse gases. So, and I wanted to look at that really emission driven, like having all the greenhouse gases not prescribed or anything, but really do a process level emission driven study. But for that, we need to have that all more properly in the model, especially the methane and the N2O processes. CO2 we do have. So, and that's, that's a little bit why I always say when I grow up, I want to be you, because we still have to do quite a lot of development to get there. But just as an announcement, to let you know, we're really excited to work on this, and hopefully soon we start writing proposal in that direction. And we really hope to work with you.
Oh, thank you so much. I very much looking forward to that. Yeah. And by the way, do you happen to know Matt Hayek from NYU?
Actually, I don't.
Oh, I see. I think he's relatively new there, and he also graduated from Harvard. Actually, we are classmates back then, and he's looking a lot at food system emissions right now. And I think he would be well. He's just in the same city as you folks, so I guess we can definitely try to connect and see what we can do together. Yeah, I'm very excited about this.
Yes.
I really want to visit New York as well again.
Yes, we definitely would love to have you. Okay, I know Jonathan also put a comment in the chat, but obviously I don't want to keep you up too much longer, Amos. So, Jonathan, if you want to speak to that, like very quickly.
Oh yeah, no problem at all. No problem at all. Because like I'm really sort of awakened by the energy.
Good. I'll try to keep it quick anyway. But since you mentioned NYU, do you know David Cantor?
I am familiar with this name, yeah, but
Okay.
yeah.
So he's also doing some work with Danica Lombardozzi on ozone damage and NOx emissions and stuff like that. So there's obviously some interesting parallels, and he's one of the most. I mean, that department's really super young, which makes him, he's like 6 years in, and he's the most senior person there. But NYU's there's definitely interesting stuff going there. I put something in the comment, but actually my question was, you mentioned looking in the future to doing some work with the 4R kind of stuff. And I was wondering how you're going to do that. Is that a DNDC? Like, are you just, how do you simulate crop uptake, placement, timing, amount of fertilizer applications in a global model?
Oh wow! I mean, like this is something that we are still thinking about and trying to see what other people have done. So, if you're familiar with Denise Moseral, she has a couple of she has one or two papers on that as well. And I think what she did, what their team did, is to basically just dive into the literature and really just use the sort of empirical result directly. Right, the percentage reduction in nitrogen from a particular practice, and then put that into the model. And I think this is something that we would plan to test first, because the literature would be showing very different. Even for similar kind of agricultural practices, they can show very different numbers. Yeah, so I think these are something that connections with many agricultural scientists in mainland China or in the US can be very helpful. I can imagine DNDC can be a very good model to use, because it has very elaborate nitrogen emission scheme and agricultural practices there, yeah, and that's what we use for intercropping. But then for the how different the 4R methods can reduce fertilizer use, I can't imagine it to be too mechanistic anyway. I think a lot of it has to be based on empirical results, basically seeing how a particular approach would reduce nitrogen by such and such percentage, and we just directly apply those number. Yeah, but maybe there are better way to do it, in the NDC, but I haven't looked too deep into this yet.
And so would you describe the intercropping work as mechanistic, the way that it was handled, or were there some kind of empirical assumptions in there too?
I think it's semi-mechanistic. Yeah, it is semi-mechanistic. The denitrification processes and the ammonia emission coming from it are kind of really there's the real chemistry there. Yeah.
And then in terms of go ahead, Maggie. We can cut it off.
Sorry, I have to cut off here, just because we have to get to additional meetings. I think we have to give back the room. But Amos, again, thank you so much. This was such a cool talk. For people that are online, and also vice versa in terms of you, Amos, if you want each other's emails, please feel free to reach out to me, or I guess also Olivia, because it really seems like a lot of what you're doing is really relevant and really exciting for people here at GISS.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I look forward to even further interactions and maybe visiting GISS at some point. Yeah, now that all of the borders are open and we can travel again.
Yeah, that would be really lovely. All right, well, we'll let you hopefully go to sleep. Thank you so
I'm all
much.
awake now, though. Right, so thank you so much again. It's my great pleasure and honor to be able to talk to you folks about this, my research.
All right,
And
ours
yours.
too. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, thank you. Bye. Keep in touch.